Welcome back to everyone. Our last session of the day will examine recent developments with policy frameworks for artificial intelligence, including a review of important human rights frameworks, including the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Artificial Intelligence Principles, and the Universal Guidelines for Artificial Intelligence. This panel will develop policy recommendations for improving global digital cooperation. We're pleased to begin with a keynote address by Andrew Wyckoff, currently Director for Science, Technology, and Innovation at the OECD, who previously served as head of the Information, Computer, and Communications Policy Division at the OECD, which supports the organization's work on information society as well as consumer policy issues. Mr. Wyckoff will frame our discussion by providing an overview of the OECD Artificial Intelligence Principles and the OECD Artificial Intelligence Observatory. A hearty welcome, Andrew Wyckoff.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here, and I just want to thank the organizers of the Club of Rome and Boston Global Forum for the invitation and the opportunity to speak today. As other speakers have said, AI is what we would call a general purpose technology. It's going to be used across all the economy and society. And because of that, it will affect policy areas in many different parts, not just technological policy, but employment and skills, competition policy, and so forth. Because it's a digital technology, it's inherently born global. And so this becomes an international problem, one of coordination. It's for that reason that the OECD began work on this in 2016 to see how we could capture and harness this general purpose technology while at the same time developing policies that would minimize the risks and maximize the benefits. Let me briefly tell you about some of the work we've been doing, especially the principles. In May of 2019, our 37 member countries at the OECD and 7 additional countries adopted these AI principles as what we would call soft law here at the OECD. Why they don't have a binding requirement, there's moral suasion to adhere to them. A month later, they went to the G20, and under the Japanese presidency, they were adopted by the G20 countries as well, committed to these same principles. Now, I want to emphasize that they're principles. This means they're rather high level. They're intended really to be lines on the road that we stay between, but not necessarily dictating how many wheels the vehicle should have. We did this so that we could stay relevant and be a little bit future-proof in an area that's changing quite dramatically and quickly. But also we wanted to get upstream into the innovation phase, so we're more proactive than dealing with the technology at the end of pipe, which is a more of a reactive mode. The principles consist of 5 policy principles and 5 principles for stewardship and trustworthy AI. I'll quickly read them off. Principles for responsible stewardship include inclusive growth, sustainable development and well-being, human-centered values and fairness, transparency and explainability, robustness, security and safety, and accountability. They take advantage of existing applicable law, which is relevant in many places, and they were based on many other lists that were being developed at the same time. So they're not unique, but rather they build on these other lists, particularly the work by the Council of Europe and UNESCO. As I said, by being endorsed by these 44 OECD and related countries, as well as the G20, I estimate that about 90% of the world's AI actors are covered by these principles one way or another. Prominently, what's missing is Africa. And as our last session just pointed out, this is a problem. And we need to try to get them to Africa, because Africa, first, AI holds tremendous promise of dealing with some of the global challenges that continent faces, but also AI could worsen the digital divide that already exists. Now, I'm speaking to you from Paris, France. General Charles de Gaulle, who came on to become president of France after World War II, famously said, "How can we oversee a country that with 258 different types of cheese?" A little bit like cheeses in France, AI has many different types, and with that, we need to develop a classification scheme for them so that we can apply policies, the right policies to the right types of AI. This is a first step. And let me tell you how we're approaching that with two different initiatives that we have recently launched. The first is what we call the AI Observatory. It is an online platform with tremendous amount of information that can help people implement the AI principles. The information is structured around four different pillars, the first of which is the principles themselves and efforts to implement them. The second is policy analysis we're undertaking across 20 different policy areas. The third pillar is that of data and live streaming of relevant data, and this data repository is quickly growing. Last but certainly not least is a catalog of country policy initiatives, as well as stakeholder initiatives that begins to allow us to exchange and learn from each other in this important area. The second initiative that we launched is something called One AI. This is OECD's network of experts, One on AI. It has three functions. These are experts that draw from a multi-stakeholder community of business, civil society, organized labor, government officials, in the technical community. They have three working groups, which I want to briefly describe this evening. The first working group is working on those classifications of different cheeses. What are the different classifications for AI? And this matters because AI for healthcare may have severe privacy issues, while for finance, the issue may be more about security, while lastly, for automated vehicles, it may be primarily safety. Also, depending on the AI used, neural networks tend to have issues more around accuracy and explainability than systems that use symbolic methods. And likewise, chatbots are more prone to issues of bias than other applications. Working Group 2 is looking to provide practical guidance on things such as how to make human rights and bake it into the policies of AI. Fairness and accountability are addressed by this working group as well, looking at practical tools that can implement these principles into policies. Now, this is work in progress, and I have to tell you, it's not easy. We're taking a deep dive into the tools and monitoring the different modalities and approaches to tackling these challenges. We undertook a survey, and with that survey, we've learned about 70 different responses to these challenges, which we're now going through to try to identify the best and the most innovative approaches to these problems. But, and to give you a little bit of a sense of this, because I think this is incredibly important, the first are things called process-related challenges. These are issues like risk management. There's some very interesting tools being developed by companies like Ernst & Young and IBM, as well as organizations like Element AI and OpenAI. The second are more technical approaches, such as those being approached by ISO and NIST in the United States to try to discern bias detection and get towards explainable AI. The last is capacity building by organizations such as UNESCO, with whom we're working closely, and the UK Information Commissioner's Office. Working Group 3 is developing practical guidance on policy makers. Issues such as how to build a digital ecosystem to support AI and a policy environment that's suitable for that. Human capacity is essential here in getting the right skills in, as well as getting handshakes for international cooperation. And again, here, we're actively working with Council of Europe and UNESCO. Working Group 3 is really about policy design. in helping countries develop their own national strategy. Now, on the AI observatory that I remarked about, there are more than 300 different policies that are covering 60 different countries. Let me just end by thanking you for your attention and saying that it's not just my part of the OECD, it's 7 different parts of the OECD working on it. And now we're being joined, we're the Secretariat for the new Global Partnership on AI, which brings a new technical implementation ability to the work that we've developed on the principles. Thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Wyckoff, for this very lucid framing. We now invite you to join the panel, which will be facilitated by Mark Rotenberg, who many of you will recognize from our second segment in the series on digital technologies, elections, and democracy in times of COVID-19, back in August. Mr. Rotenberg is the director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Policy at the Michael Dukakis Institute, and will give us a brief overview of his work at the center before leading the discussion with our distinguished panel. Welcome back, Mark.
Thank you, Andy, for the excellent presentation. We appreciate the OECD's work to develop an international framework for AI and to develop and to track policy developments. The OECD has long been a leader in the technology policy field. The OECD privacy guidelines, for example, are among the most influential global policy frameworks, and we look forward to the implementation of the OECD AI principles. As Milburn mentioned, I am the director of the newly established Center for AI and Digital Policy at the Michael Dukakis Institute. Our aim is to promote AI practices that protect fundamental rights, the rule of law, and democratic institutions. We have established a new website. It's at caidp.dukakis.org to track AI developments around the world. We're also featuring books by experts in the AI policy field. We are noting new initiatives by political leaders, and we are collaborating with partner organizations. Later this year, we will publish the AI Social Index the AI Social Contract Index, which we believe is the first attempt to actually measure and rank national AI policies. We'll also be working to promote the AI Social Contract, gathering support from leaders, innovators, thinkers, and advocates around the globe for this important initiative. I want to thank my friends and colleagues at the Boston Global Forum, and particularly Tuan, for their support for this undertaking. And I want to thank the Club de Madrid and the panelists for their support for this timely panel on AI policy frameworks. Now, as you know, there are many AI policy frameworks. One survey put the number at 243. I've seen another survey that suggests over 300 different policy frameworks for AI. I haven't checked this morning, but I'm sure that number continues to rise. We are, however, going to focus our discussion today on just a few of the leading frameworks for AI policy. Andy has mentioned the OECD AI principles. We will also be looking at the Universal Guidelines for Artificial Intelligence, the current work of the Council of Europe and the European Union, and of course the social contract for the age of AI. And we will ask a question that not many developers of policy frameworks typically ask, which is, how do we measure progress toward the goals set out in these frameworks? What are the key indicators? In most simple terms, how do we measure success? Let me now introduce and welcome our panelists. We have first Ambassador Regine Greinberger, recently appointed Ambassador for Cyber Policy from the German government. Professor Peggy Valke is the Vice Chair of the Council of Europe's Committee on Artificial Intelligence, also Professor of Law at the University of Leuven. Dr. Lorraine Kisselberg is the inaugural chair of the ACM's Technology Policy Council, and Prime Minister Zlatko Lagunja is a member of the Club of Madrid and the former Prime Minister of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Prime Minister has actually provided critical advice for us for the social contract on AI and is one of the original signatories. Thank you all for being with us today. We will begin with brief presentations on the specific work on AI policy that our panelists are pursuing. We will then have 2 rounds of questions. I will ask a follow-up question after the presentation, then we will take questions from our audience. And then we will have a final statement and a brief summary. To our audience, you can ask questions to the panelists using the questions tool. We will then present those questions. And now to our panelists, who will provide a brief overview of their current work. Ambassador Greinberger, the German government chairs the European Council for the second half of 2020. What will be the priorities for the German country, particularly in the areas of AI and digital governance?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you. I'm very honored to be able to contribute to this distinguished panel. Can you hear me? I have a little echo in my sound.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So let me start with our German perspective on AI. You will realize that there is a specific German interest in both promoting AI as a potential source for future prosperity, and on the other hand, regulating it to make sure that it is human-centered, that it respects the fundamental right, and that it is not part of the dark forces, something that many of the electorate of our politicians might think about this new technology. AI is without doubt a key technology, and Germany has made research and application of artificial intelligence a political and economic priority. My government set up a national artificial intelligence strategy in November 2018 with a broad approach from machine learning, computer vision, robotics, software for cars, of course, traffic guidance systems, but even research on soft robots whose design is based on nature and medical applications. In the wake of the corona pandemic, my government has decided to increase the investment in artificial intelligence from 3 to 5 billion euros by 2025. And this money is spent for both research and teaching, attractive framework conditions, and state-of-the-art infrastructure. On the basis of our national AI ambition, the German government included a whole chapter on a stronger and more innovative Europe into the German presidency program, which I sent to Mark Rottenberg. I hope he was able to distribute it or to post it on the website. For those of you who are not so much into European housekeeping, a presidency on the Council of Member States means that it's rotating every 6 months, and a group of 3 member states, the so-called trio, coordinates more closely, so we have a planning period of 18 months altogether. In our case, we coordinate with Portugal and Slovenia, and our trio started in summer 2020 and goes until end of 2021. The presidency program was just finished when we realized that we must come up with a common European response to the impact of COVID-19. We needed a response, but we considered this also an opportunity to accelerate digital transformation. There is another concept that you will find in the presidency program, the need to expand European digital and technological sovereignty. Because the pandemic has shown more clearly than ever before that Europe must achieve sovereignty in the digital domain in order to remain capable of action of our own. The European Commission shares this approach and established digital sovereignty also as a leitmotif of the European digital agenda. Technical developments such as artificial intelligence and quantum technologies can ensure that in the context of fair competition, we increase our prosperity, protect our security, and uphold our values. The European Commission published in February 2020 a white paper on AI, which announced a European initiative on AI based on an existing older AI strategy on the European level, also of 2018. The main elements of this initiative will be to boost the technological and industrial capacity and AI uptake across the economy, both by private and public sector. There will be financial instruments to support this, but also regulatory elements to create a level playing field, legal certainty for the business sector, and a long-term investment perspective. But there's also a certain urgency to prepare for socio-economic changes brought about by AI, and therefore we deem it necessary that the European way of life is protected, and the introduction of a revolutionary technology like AI is accompanied by modernizing also education and training systems, anticipating changes in the labor market, and other issues. The member states will also have to prepare certain support for labor market transitions and adaptation of social protection systems. Last but not least, the European Commission has also made it very clear that the Union has to ensure an appropriate ethical and legal framework based on the Union's values and in line with the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the EU. This includes guidance on existing product liability rules, a detailed analysis of emerging challenges, and cooperation with stakeholders through a European AI alliance. We want also to preserve the openness of the European single market. Unfortunately, the preparatory works for this framework have been delayed due to COVID-19, and we will not be able to begin the debate among member states on this dossier during our presidency. But we have seen some smaller products of the Commission's work in the meantime. For example, we have now an assessment list for trustworthy AI, a checklist for business and organizations that helps to self-assess the trustworthiness of artificial intelligence system under development. Trustworthy AI, it was already mentioned, is a central concept of the European approach, setting the basis for a lawful, ethical and robust use of AI. You will find in the German presidency program some other dossier with the digital big D in its title, like, for example, consolidating a monitoring system for European digital capacities, or establishment of a high-performance, sovereign and resilient digital infrastructure. Also the target to achieve equivalent livelihoods in urban and rural areas. We are committed to an efficient, innovation-friendly and future-proof regulatory framework. We want to expand evidence-based legislation, further strengthen a regulatory impact assessment, extend also the use of experimentation clauses and of regulatory sandboxes. The EU's unified economic area without internal borders is the bedrock of our prosperity, social security and cohesion. A competitive European industrial sector and vibrant small and medium-sized enterprises are essential for mastering the digital transformation. We are committed to a forward-looking EU structural policy that strengthens also the region's competitiveness, and our focus is on innovative economic change, climate and environmental protection, and also sustainable employment. We, as the presidency, we want to conclude the negotiations on this new legislative package of the structural funds, which means money investments in digitalization. Artificial intelligence is a big part of it. Other innovative technologies and human capital is a major priority. And if we manage this by December, we'll be happy and tired. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Valke, the Council of Europe is developing policy proposals on artificial intelligence. What are the key priorities for your work?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk about the activities of the Council of Europe. I would like to first highlight the important role of the Council of Europe, which is the oldest political organization on the continent, established after the Second World War, covering 47 members and 830 million of people. So it provides actually a unique pan-European legal and judicial space. All of its 47 members have signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, which is not only directly applicable before national courts, but where also the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg act as a safety net in case human rights are violated at national level. Now, besides the European Convention on Human Rights, there are also over 200 conventions which have been agreed upon by Council of Europe members, and I would like to name just two, which will hopefully all sound very familiar to you. There is the Convention 108 Plus on data protection, considered the grandmother of the GDPR, and the well-known Convention on Cybercrime, to which also non-members of the Council of Europe have signed up. Now, the approach of the Council of Europe towards artificial intelligence is twofold. And first of all, there are the traditional pillars within the Council of Europe, the vertical pillars, focusing on human rights, democracy, and rule of law, which have in previous years produced quite a substantive amount of soft law instruments and studies on artificial intelligence. Let me highlight a few examples. There has been a recommendation and a declaration already both by the Parliamentary Assembly and the Committee of Ministers focusing on human rights implications of algorithmic decision-making systems. There has been the update of Convention 108 on data protection in light of new technologies such as big data and algorithmic decision-making. There has been the new expert committee that has been set up, which will look into the implications on free speech of digital technologies and artificial intelligence in particular. So this is the vertical approach, the existing pillars, expert bodies, which look into the effects of artificial intelligence on their specific area, ranging from free speech to non-discrimination to cybersecurity and cybercrime, etc. And next to that, there is the new horizontal approach of the Council of Europe, which started with the establishment of the CAHAI, so the Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence. This is a new intergovernmental committee set up in September 2019 with a mandate towards the Committee of Ministers to be finished by December 2021, so by December of next year. Now, who sits on that Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence? First of all, there are the representatives of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, representatives also of observer states like Israel, Holy See, Canada, Japan, Mexico, United States. Other bodies, international organizations like the European Union, the OECD, the United Nations and UNESCO in particular, Private sector organizations also have been admitted as observers, as well as civil society and academia. Now, what will the CAHI do? On top of the ongoing work in the vertical pillar, the mission of CAHI is to examine, and I'm quoting now from a mission document, is to examine the feasibility and potential elements on the basis of broad multi-stakeholder consultations of a legal framework for the development, design, and application of artificial intelligence, based on the Council of Europe standards on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Now, important in that work is avoiding duplication. It has been made clear that relevant existing universal and regional international legal instruments, work that is undertaken by other Council of Europe bodies, ongoing work in international organizations has to be taken into account, and that any initiative should be based on a broad multi-stakeholder debate. So how is CAHI fulfilling its mission? So far, there have been 2 plenary meetings. There's also a bureau which convenes more often, which currently consists of 5 members, but which may be extended. The bureau consists evidently of the chair of CAHI, which is my Slovenian colleague Gregor Strojin. And besides myself as vice chair and representative of Belgium, there's also the representative of Italy, France, Estland, and Germany, and Switzerland in the bureau. So that's actually 6. So we are, I've given the wrong number. I'm sorry. Lawyers and numbers have never been a good mix. Now, in order to speed up our work, it has been decided earlier this year to set up 3 working groups within the CAHI. So first working group is the policy development group, the activities of which have started over the summer and which will have its first meeting next Monday and Tuesday. And the task of this policy development group is actually to prepare the feasibility study that then will be discussed in the plenary meeting. A second working group is the consultation and outreach group to oversee, to monitor, to stimulate stakeholder discussions at different levels, including also national and local level. And the third working group is the legal frameworks group, a working group whose activities will only start in January 2021, and which will take the feasibility study prepared by the policy development group as its starting point to actually prepare a scenario or different scenarios for a legal framework on artificial intelligence. I would also like to bring to your attention 3 excellent reports which have been prepared earlier this year in the context of the CAHI. One is a study by Kathleen Muller of the Ally, mapping the impact of artificial intelligence on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. A second study has been a mapping exercise by Alessandro Mantelero of international binding instruments that already enshrine some of the principles that come to the fore as guiding principles for the legal framework. And a third important study is a mapping of the ethical instruments that have been developed in previous years, also with the aim to see what are guiding principles that come to the fore in ethical discussions and that can also underpin the instrument that will be developed by the working group focusing on the legal framework. I'm checking the clock to see if I have exhausted my time. If not, I would be happy to continue explaining. You have to stop me, Mark, because otherwise I'll just continue.
That was very good. Thank you so much for your presentation. And also, let me explain to people who are following our conference these papers and and policy initiatives will be available at the conference website and also at the website for the Center for AI and Digital Policy, where we are building a big collection, and we hope everyone will take the opportunity to look at this very good work in the AI policy field. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Lorraine Kisselberg, the chair of the ACM Technology and Policy Council.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Lorraine, and I thank you so much to Club de Madrid and Boston Global Forum for hosting this discussion and for inviting me to participate today. I'm pleased to have the chance to highlight some of the work the Association for Computing Machinery, known as ACM, is doing in the policy world, and also discuss the Universal Guideline for AI, which I helped to work on. So ACM is the oldest international society of computer scientists and professionals with over 100,000 members worldwide. And in public policy, our mission is to provide technical expertise to policymakers and the general public in order to better inform technology policy. So we have a long record. Our policy work has a 25-year history in the United States, a more recent 5-year history in Europe. And then this year, we launched a new global council, which I am chairing, and looking to expand that reach more broadly. So we have about 150 members from ACM who are involved in our policy groups, and they volunteer their expertise to develop white papers, statements, comments, provide briefings and testimonies and so forth to policymakers. And in essence, we focus on ensuring that emerging policy is well-informed and grounded in scientific evidence and professional practice. And as a society of computer scientists and professionals, we are especially engaged in discussions around artificial intelligence because AI, as you know, emerged from the field of computer science. So in terms of policy issues, we focus on matters of cybersecurity, privacy, law, intellectual property, election security, digital governance, and artificial intelligence. And this year, we've also specifically turned to issues of AI bias, biometric data systems, climate change, and smart cities. So the political landscape in the United States and Europe have clearly shaped activity this year. There's much emerging legislation, both in the United States as well as the European Union, around artificial intelligence and the governance of that. There are growing calls for racial and social justice in the United States and in other nations in the world, which have focused attention on biometric data systems, specifically facial recognition technologies. And the upcoming elections in the United States and evidence of interference in election systems has tapped what has been a point of expertise in ACM for 25 years. Secure voting technologies, databases, mobile voting, and mail-in ballots. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes to highlight 3 examples of our work that we've done specifically on artificial intelligence in ACM. And copies of these statements and documents, as Mark Rautenberg just mentioned, are available on the website for this conference and beyond. So 3 years ago, in 2017, we released one of the early statements of principles on algorithmic transparency and accountability. And this was focused on algorithmic decision-making and the early concerns with fairness, accountability, and transparency, or bias, assessment, and explainability. And it framed expectations in algorithmic design and development, as well as needs for oversight and regulation. More recently this year, responding to growing concerns about facial recognition technologies, those that are used for public surveillance, and calls for racial justice led to our most recent statement on facial recognition. This statement restates fundamental concerns about privacy and security, but the focus here is on biometric data protection and the potential bias and inaccuracies that have significant consequences for violation of human rights in policing, criminal justice, as well as employment and other liberties. And the pandemic, of course, this spring demanded a reevaluation of our priorities and renewed policy challenges that we often face in considering individual rights with national security or in this case, global public health threats. And so the European group released a statement a couple of months ago on contact tracing technologies and application, again focusing on security and privacy vulnerabilities, but also issues of cross-border interoperability, transparency, oversight, and necessary safeguards. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes more to address the universal guidelines for AI, just with the time that I have allocated to me. This is not something from ACM, but instead was a project of the Public Voice. And so in 2018, I was a resident scholar at EPIC, and we worked to develop a set of guidelines for the design, development, and implementation of AI. And we started with the belief that using a human rights framework to inform policy development and law surrounding AI provides a set of principles that are ethically aligned, are universal, and can be adopted in legal contexts that are appropriate for specific nations. So these guidelines were launched in October of 2018 in Brussels, and they were endorsed by 70 organizations and 300 individuals around the world. And thanks to the very careful leadership of Mark Rotenberg, these principles, I believe, help to inform a number of other subsequent AI frameworks, including the OECD AI principles, which we fully endorse. But a couple of comments about this. The UGAI guidelines include what are now consensus principles of fairness, accountability, and transparency. They also focus on data accuracy, validity, and quality, and as well safety and security, reliability, and robustness. But also included are principles around autonomy, agency, and freedom from intrusion and state interference. And this overlooked part of the universal guidelines, I think, deserves much more attention because it makes explicit the prohibition of excessive power that comes from large-scale data collection and invisible profiling. And here, I'm going to refer back to Dr. Patterson's opening remarks on social contract theory. Systems of mandatory large data collection, whether by governments or monopolistic industries, are a tool of power that, when unchecked, lead to a society without lawful restraints on power, and ultimately a failure to protect life, liberty, and property. And Patterson notes that social contracts are rooted in the rights and interests of individuals.
I think we've lost you, Lorraine. Well, I'm afraid we've lost the feed from Lorraine Kisselberg, but I do want to thank her so much for the very good presentation, and also to note we talk a lot about the participation of stakeholders in the development of policy, but it's particularly important, I think, for the technology experts in their domain to be able to advise us on these issues, for example, helping AI policy frameworks arise. So thank you to Lorraine and the members of the ACM Technology Policy Council for the work that you're doing. It's very important. Prime Minister, you have heard from these experts on AI policy. They've described several frameworks and procedures for developing their next steps. What is your assessment, and what would you recommend to ensure adoption and implementation?
Thank you, Mark. First, I want to congratulate you, Mark. I mean, the rest of the group that I was really very privileged to be part of, that were putting together and doing final touch for this social contract in age of artificial intelligence. I learned a lot. And I think that we have in front of us really good piece of work. We have good set of principles that now we have to see how we can make them alive. And today we just heard, I mean, just as you said, adoption and implementation. When it comes to adoption, obviously we have very solid work behind us. Now we heard what the Council of Europe is doing. We heard very eloquently what German's presidency of the European Union means for the future of digital transformation, artificial intelligence in general. We heard Andrew in the very beginning, who was giving us very good, let's say, X-ray of what OECD is doing. It's a very powerful organization that is putting together most powerful economically, most powerful countries together. So what we see from here is that, and especially today with the social contract, that is comprehensive and holistic approach that is consists out of the principles, objectives, stakeholders, and things to do, and very clear roles of how we should proceed. So now the question is, it's not about how many ideas we have, it's about how many of those ideas we make alive. The question is how we can move forward. You see, OECD, for example, OECD is an organization that has beautiful 5 principles, 5 to do for the government's things. And as Andrew said, it's not legally binding, but it is very, very influential. And that is definitely so. Council of Europe also is doing the things that are extraordinary, but those things are not like European Convention of Human Rights and Freedoms, which there is a court in Strasbourg that is dealing with not binding with those principles of human rights. Of course, European Union is great, doing a great thing. You in Boston Global Forum, Mark and Darren Dukakis, Tuan, and you people that are around there from MIT and Harvard, you're doing a great job. But now the question is how we can move forward, how we can let's say, move to walk after we do the talk. And that's maybe the biggest challenge that is in front of us. I think that what is important in here, this concept of multi-stakeholderism concept that we adopted together, all of us together, is the way forward to make a public and other pressure, to create awareness of the issue and to make a pressure on all stakeholders and ultimately on the governments and thereafter on the multilateral institutions. Why I'm saying on multilateral institutions? Because future of artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence, age of artificial intelligence, is going to be defined as a global age. So the problems in artificial intelligence, issues and problems, potential problems, as well as solutions, have to be global, which leads us to the question of governance, of the global governance. We have 3 elements that we have to take in consideration. First, we have to have an idea. We have to have people who are committed to it, who are capable of doing something, and we have to have organization structure that will support these things. I think that we have an idea, and on the end, I mean, people move the world, but ideas are moving the people. So I think we have a good fundament to proceed. The question is how to make a pressure on we in the social contract who identified decision makers or stakeholders, groups of them. First, individuals, citizen groups, education people, mostly people like us. And we are doing our job, but our job is actually to make a pressure on the people who can do much more. This is first, second group of stakeholders, governments, and ultimately the collaboration of the governments that leads to the United Nations. Business entities are the ones that also, we have to move them. Civil society, and finally, artificial intelligence assistance. But the governments and multilateral organizations are the ones who have to do the job. We cannot replace the governments and multilateral organizations, but we can make them be better and give them know-how, give them the pressure for that to let's say, do something which we. So I think that what we need is, as one part of our social contract, is saying that I think that we need some kind of, as it says, we have to extend international human rights standards for artificial intelligence, creating conventions on artificial intelligence and establishing a specialized UN agency on artificial intelligence. I call it, for the working purposes, IAEA, like we have a IAEA, which is International Atomic Energy Agency. I think we have now to move to the next level of the game, which is practically moved towards to international artificial intelligence agencies. So the bottom line is people, education of the people, awareness of the people, idea. We have a social contract, not only social contract, but a lot of papers that we were just talking about. But ultimately, we have to have institutions. Institutions, because countries are today all over the world are falling and raising up because of the quality of the institutions. For global problem, we have to have global governance, and that requires institutions. So I think that we are on a way to create institutions that will not replace business community, governments, civil society, academic community, artificial intelligence agency, but that will put them together under certain values and principles, and finally to be part of the social contract that is needed.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I think you've asked the critical question, which is how do we move forward with these initiatives? I'm aware of the time, and I'd like to maximize the opportunity for our panelists to speak, also to take a few questions from the audience. So first of all, if you are listening in and you have a question, please do use the question tool. We've received one question already, which I think I will put to the German ambassador for cyber policy. And then perhaps we'll go back to our panelists and ask the question, how do we move forward? What are the next steps for concrete implementation in the AI realm? So let me come first to Ambassador Greinberger. A person asks, it's said that artificial intelligence is correlated with job loss. And the more sophisticated AI gets, the more jobs are being threatened. In your opinion, how do we make AI tools available to citizens that do not substitute for them as workers?
Actually, that's exactly the reason why our Ministry of Labor claims the penholdership on this dossier. Because, of course, there is this possibility of AI replacing people in the labor market. But do you hear me?
Yes.
But of course, it's not given that it will be like that. I mean, we had other technological developments that have also replaced one part of the labor force by others who had to be better prepared, have a better training, and have done other things. I think. I mean, that's also why Germany looks at this whole dossier from two angles. One is what kind of advantages are in there, what prosperity can we create, what potential of innovation and also welfare are in there. And on the other hand, how can we make it serve the people? So this is a question that we have to deal with.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question, I think this one goes to the Prime Minister. A classic debate is the harmonization of interests between the private and public sectors. What is the first step to moving forward to a balance that favors the common good? Mr. Prime Minister, I think you may be muted.
There is an old phrase that in politics, it's Churchill, I think, was saying that in politics there are no friends or allies, it's just interests. And today we have to move beyond that. That politics that is based only on interests, without being based on certain principles and values, is going to leave us to the dead-end street. The same thing applies to the partnership between business sector and governments. I think that there's big why that is very clear. Why the governments and businesses, as well as us, who are coming from academic community, NGO sector, and why we have to work together, because we are first time confronted after atomic energy with something that if it gets out of the hands, it may be disastrous for all of us. So we have no other way, but to cooperate. And I think that what we were looking at for in social contract on the very beginning, when we were identifying 10 key areas, I think there are a few areas that are very good for strategies that are of interest and for governments and for businesses. First one is sustainable development and inclusive growth. It's absolute interest of both, so to speak, stakeholders. Skills, education, and talent development. This is field which is very clearly excellent area for cooperation with the governments. And finally, ethics, values, and inclusion. Mark, you know very well, I think that the governments and businesses are very much interested on the end that we don't get stuck in something which is going beyond the ethics for everyone. And I think that ethics index, that AI ethics index, is one of the areas that has a common interest, and for business community to define those things in order to have a play field very well defined. Measuring or adoption of AI principles is one of the things that has a big interest, and for governments and for business communities to have, let's say, to be aware and know much more about it. And finally, last but not least, I think that it is very important that we have a partnership in between science and decision makers who are in governments and business community, because the dangerous thing is when politicians and leaders neglect science, but this science also is not the overall solution for all our problems. It requires more than science. It requires wisdom, it requires shared thinking, it requires shared society approach, understanding that we are all gone, all lost, if we don't work together. So I think that's where we should try to search our so to speak, solution. And finally, education. I'm sorry that we didn't mention that much more about education. We have to do much more in education, and business community and governments are interested much more in better education about consequences of artificial intelligence and potential usage that will be in the hands of future generation, not in the hands of artificial intelligence.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much for those key points. I think I'd like to go next to Peggy, who both described the long tradition of the Council of Europe protecting fundamental rights, the rule of law, democratic institutions, and noted also at least two very influential conventions. One is the Convention 108, the recently modernized Privacy Convention, and also the Convention on Cybercrime, the so-called Budapest Convention. And I guess the question to you, Peggy, is do you see a similar legal instrument, a convention from the Council of Europe, emerging for artificial intelligence? You seem to be actually well positioned and doing the work that would make such an outcome possible.
That is indeed one of the possible scenarios, Mark, but it's not the only scenario. And all options are still open for the moment. So it could go from formulating an additional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights, because in earlier studies and soft law of the Council of Europe, it has been suggested that perhaps we need additional human rights, like the right not to be manipulated, the right to meaningful human interaction. That is one option. Another option is indeed the convention that you mentioned, in which certain principles, certain definitions would be agreed upon. Other options, more, I would say, then with less teeth, would be soft law instruments like recommendations and declarations, in which a number of rules would be further elaborated on. So for the moment, the options are still open. And this is exactly the work that needs to be undertaken this autumn in the context of the Policy Development Working Group.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that update. If we could come back to Andy Wyckoff, who gave us that very good presentation at the opening, and I noticed that there are now 44 countries that have signed on to the OECD AI principles. But Andy, as you noted, also there is no enforcement authority behind the OECD. Countries can choose to adopt these standards if they wish. The private sector can incorporate in their business practices if they choose to do so. And it seems to me that the big question to the OECD for the AI principles, as was also true for the privacy guidelines, is how do we give this the force of law? How do we put some strength behind these principles that national governments have endorsed?
Thank you, Mark. And I referred to this a little bit in my keynote, which I welcome having a lot of time, is that, yeah, it's true. We don't have the force of law behind us. Our principles aren't binding. We do have other means. One of those is through empirical measurement data. Our league tables have been known to move people in the right direction just by pointing out that they're not up to where the OECD average is or where some of the front runners are. The other mechanism we use here is peer reviews, where we look at a country's policies, we bring it to the table, and we allow not only the governments to sit around our table, but we have our stakeholders there as well, which includes civil society and business and organized labor and the technical community. The last way we do it is we undertake analysis. And I think it's trying to put an evidence base with analytical work underneath this that is needed. A lot of AI now is still its very early stage, and it's driven a little bit by passion and politics, which is completely understandable. But to get rational policies and to help businesses and the AI developers doing serious policy analysis is needed as well. And we're part of what's really a growing broad community undertaking work in this area. And then the last thing, Mark, is to partner with those organizations that do have more of a legal implementation authority than what the OECD has.
That's great, Andy. Thank you so much. What we will do now is move to our wrap-up stage, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make a brief remark focused on a concrete recommendation, how we move this process forward, whether it's through implementation or measurement or some other technique that you think would be particularly effective. Lorraine, I know we'd like to get you back into the discussion. The organizers advise me that you will need to disconnect and reconnect so we can get your audio feedback. Okay, let's go first to Ambassador Greinberger.
You're completely right that that regulatory framework for AI has to go across different organizations. It's not possible to establish a national or a regional regime. It has to be something that has at least a global ambition. I wanted to add to Professor Falke. Professor Falke's remarks that Germany will start the chairmanship or the presidency in the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in November. And we support very much the work of the KHI to find rules for AI. And I can announce that we will have in January 2021 Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Justice together, a high-level conference on AI and regulation in Berlin, and I hope that we will be able to make some progress towards some kind of legal framework, whatever form it will take. Thank you.
Thank you. Peggy, to you. I think you're muted. Can we get you to unmute?
Is that better? Sorry, my apologies. I was asking you if you would allow me to change hats for just a second, and instead of speaking on behalf of the Council of Europe, give you perhaps my personal opinion on where to move
Good.
forward with the Kahai. So a precedent within the Council of Europe that I have always, or that I see as an important example of what we could do in relation to artificial intelligence is the Oviedo Convention in the area of biomedicine. This is a framework convention on the protection of human dignity with regards to biotechnology, biomedicine, where it has, for instance, made very clear that we don't want human cloning, we don't want designer babies, and I think this is the type of instrument that we need also for artificial intelligence at the supranational level. And from such basic principles, broadly supported principles, we can then further define more detailed rules in either the specific pillars of the Council of Europe or European Union instruments, national laws, and of course, as it has been stressed before, it is extremely important not only to come up with rules, but also to monitor those rules and to make clear who is responsible for what, and if needed, set up new monitoring systems, or assign existing regulatory bodies and auditing mechanisms to carry out evaluations. Because if we put that responsibility in the hands of individual end users, I don't think that they can carry that burden. This is something that needs to be monitored at a more collective level. But that's, as I said, my personal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's actually echoes what the Prime Minister said earlier about the need for some institutional oversight in this field. I think a body that's actually dedicated to monitoring practices. So very important. Very glad to have you back, Lorraine Kesselberg.
So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes,
I apologize for not realizing I had cut out. So let me make two quick points. I'm going to make the final point that I was talking about when evidently my microphone was not working. And I was trying to take us back to social contract theory. And reminding that really what we have found out when we talk about this is social contracts are rooted in the rights and interests of individuals and what governments and other powerful entities must do and be prohibited from doing in order to safeguard those rights and interests. I think that's an important clause to keep in mind because oftentimes many of our principles and our frameworks are focusing primarily on the rights and protections of individuals, which are needed, but we need to balance that with making clear what the limits of power are for governments and monopolistic industries. The second thing I wanted to say as an obligation for being the technologist here is that I would suggest carefulness, not necessarily caution, but carefulness in the sense that there's almost an exploding umbrella of what we define to be artificial intelligence. Not everything computational or technological is AI. And so I think it's important to be able to focus a little bit more specifically when we can on what is unique about AI that creates unique challenges that need to be attended to when we're adopting regulation and governance. Loss of control, autonomy, adaptive learning in terms of machine learning approaches make it difficult to be transparent compared to earlier systems that have very static code. Increasingly ubiquitous and visible broad scope of data collection makes surveillance and privacy violations much more likely and much less likely to be resisted because they're unknown. And finally, the sophistication of visual and speech processing that's enabled through current AI allows very sophisticated manipulation of truth and reality. We see that in deepfake videos and not simply replacements of text. So these are very unique to artificial intelligence. And I think we need to pay close attention to those uniquenesses and not gather up everything into this umbrella of new technologies or automatically artificial intelligence. So definitional precision is one of my favorite terms. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you. Mr. Prime Minister, do you have a final point? I think you're also on mute.
I'm sorry. I think that we have to ultimately everyone's voice count. And I think that we all have to do everything is in our power to make a pressure on decision makers in the sense of making awareness and creating a sense of urgency that something has to be done in this sense. And I think that's the points where we have to make pressure are people with the biggest power, which are governments today and multilateral organizations. Don't forget that Jeff Bezos' overall wealth cannot cover 2 weeks of a U.S. budget, annual budget. So I mean, the real power is in governments and multilateral organizations, but we are the conscious, and we should be the spirits and the movers of the governments. They are our servants. So we have to make governments to serve what is the purpose of our overall society. And I think that, as David was saying in previous discussion, human brain is organ of the mind. And what we are talking about organ. We still don't have artificial intelligence as a mind. So it is very important that we keep going in that direction, that we keep our mind in right direction, that we are better people. And our Club de Madrid favorite project, and my personal favorite project, is Share Society project, which is talking we have to be more together, sharing our identities, our experiences, our future. And as more than 50 years ago, someone said, we are living in a planet which can be called Spaceship Earth, in which no one is no more passenger, we are all the crew. With artificial intelligence, it is getting more and more important because, after all, artificial intelligence can be the new tool for the new progressive partnership of the people to share society, production in the sense of what Vint was talking about, people-centered and economy, and ultimately planet. We talk about climate change and sustainable development. That's where artificial intelligence should be our tool, not us being the tool of artificial intelligence.
Well, thank you very much for your remarks. I'm going to close with one personal story. Before I decided to become one of the few lawyers in Washington, D.C., I was actually writing computer programs to play backgammon and chess. And pretty quickly, of course, these programs could beat me and beat others. And then I was in Philadelphia in 1997, in fact, when Deep Blue beat the world chess champion, Garry Kasparov. And it took Gary about 20 years to get over that. He actually thought the match was fixed, but he wrote very well and very thoughtfully in a book I recommend called Deep Thinking. So I'm not sure what to say about our AI future. I've had a bit of personal experience. It's not much fun losing, but even in these circumstances, I think it's best to understand the technological changes that impact us all. So thank you again for your participation. I think I return it now to our Master of Ceremonies, Melbourne.
Thank you all, Ambassador Greinberger, Council Leader Vice Chair Valke, Professor Kisselberg, Andrew Wyckoff, Mark Rodenberg, and Prime Minister Lagumdzhiev for this extensive review of policy frameworks for artificial intelligence.